Galatians chapter 1, and we're going to pick up in verse 6 in just a minute. Before we do that, curious, does anybody recognize the name Linda Hazard? I kind of guessed not. Good to see I anticipated that right. In the early 1900s, in a small town in Washington State, really late 1800s into the early 1900s, there was a woman named Linda Hazard, and people would come to her because they were dealing with various physical or mental maladies. And she believed all of those issues came from impure blood because of digestive issues. So her cure that she would prescribe was to pursue radical extended fasts as well as other means to purge the body. And eventually, her facility became known as Starvation Heights. After numerous deaths from starvation, she was criminally investigated. She became labeled by some as the state of Washington's first female serial killer. But the story is even a little more sad than that. It's not merely that she was vicious or cruel, although arguably she was, but she actually believed the false cure that she presented. Later, she died from attempting the same treatment for herself. So, Pastor Jed, what on earth does that have to do with Galatians? Well, humanity after the fall is hopelessly sick. And if we don't diagnose the problem correctly, we won't pursue the right cures. And not everything that claims to be a cure is helpful. False cures can, in fact, be fatal. Just like with Linda Hazard. As we begin this book, there's a group of false teachers who have been troubling the churches of Galatia. You see at the beginning of this chapter, it's not just one church of Galatians, it's the churches of Galatia. And these false teachers have been troubling them. In order to do that, they didn't have to look like enemies. They didn't have to be malicious or cruel in their intent. All they had to do to challenge and shake and trouble the churches of Galatia was to distort, or we could translate that word, reverse the gospel of grace through Jesus Christ. But Paul knew what these false teachers brought was in fact not a cure. It was actually deadly. So we pick up what he said in verse 6. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. Paul doesn't start with a lot of pleasantries in the book of Galatians. He has a quick introduction, which we looked at last week. But this weighs on his heart so much. And I think there's probably some historic reasons for that. I didn't address this last week, but when you think about, well, who are these people? We know the letter to the Romans was written to the church at Rome. Well, what's the churches of Galatia? What is that? Well, there's a couple theories, and you could go read people who will debate different ones. One of them, they'll call the Southern Galatian theory. That means there's a geographic region of Galatia, and Paul's writing to that group saying, the churches that are in this geographic region. That's one theory. The other theory is a northern theory where instead of Galatians referring to a geographic area, it refers to an ethnic group. Now, the term Galatians can be used either way. I'm not going to get into all the details of the argument. If you want to find them, you can either look them up or come talk to me, and I'll share some more with you. I think the southern one makes more sense with what Paul says when he writes. So I'm assuming this is the geographical location, which if that's the case, when we look in the book of Acts, we also see that these would have been some of the first converts Paul went to on his missionary journeys. And when you travel and you go to some of the first people you connect with, there's a special place in your heart for those people. I'm sure Paul cared about all the people he went and preached the gospel to, but there was a sense that he looked at them with fondness. You were some of the first people I preached this gospel to as I traveled, and they had responded well. And so that's why here, it's like he doesn't have time to go through some of the pleasantries and all the other conversations. He just says, I am astonished. I'm blown away. I'm bewildered. I'm shocked that you have left this gospel that is so good that I taught you, and you are at least in danger of deserting it. It's not an emotionless theological treatise. Paul's writing to people he loves and he cares about, and he knows what it will mean for them if they accept this different gospel. We'll come back to that in just a minute. If they accept what these false teachers are teaching them, he knows what it will mean for them. And this language, it's all strong. I'm astonished. That's not a small word, right? That he's not using it merely for effect. He's like, I can't believe this. This is terrible. Later he'll say, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Paul's view of the gospel of grace is that it is so good that for you to take anything that would distort that gospel, you'd have to be under some kind of evil spell. That's what that language is used there for. I'm astonished. Who's bewitched you? The language of you are so quickly deserting him. We use that word still for the same reason they use the Greek word. Deserting someone as a soldier is among the worst things you could do. That's what he's referring to. It's the same word for when a soldier says, forget it, I'm deserting. Or when a traitor, when a Benedict Arnold, when a turncoat leaves. This is the word that they Greeks would use for it. You're deserting, or you're in danger of deserting the army, of betraying the one who should have your allegiance. It says, and notice, it's not merely you're in danger of leaving a theological idea. Notice the way he words it in verse 6. I'm astonished you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ. I'm astonished you're leaving the God of grace. Paul's saying, I told you about God's grace. Why would you leave something so good? It's so serious that Paul makes some of his strongest statements in verse 8 and 9. If we, as an apostle, so if the apostle Paul walks in, that's what he's saying. Okay, if I come in and tell you anything but the grace of God through Jesus Christ, if I teach any other kind of gospel, let me be condemned to hell. That's what accursed means. If anyone else, and he says it twice, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, it's the right place to use this language, let him be damned to hell. That's literally what Paul is saying. Not in a flippant way. In a very serious way, he's saying, if you mess with the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of grace through Jesus, that he's already described in verse 4, the one who gave himself for our sins to deliver us from the present evil age. He loves the Galatians so much. He knows the only cure for what's wrong in their souls is the gospel of grace from Jesus Christ. So he says, listen very carefully. If someone messes up the gospel, let him be accursed. So if this is so important, we need to pause and say, wait, what is a gospel? I don't mean just what is the gospel, like the gospel of Jesus. That's one question. But Paul uses the term gospel here as a category. He says they're bringing to you a different gospel, and he says it's not really different. We'll talk about that in a second. But he's using it as a category. He's saying there's a kind of announcement that is a gospel. A gospel is a message. The word literally means good news. A gospel is a message, an announcement of good news that is supposed to impact your life. It's supposed to give you relief or rest from something. It's not really good news for you if it doesn't impact you. If I were to tell you that somewhere around the world, there's someone who just received this incredible gift, and now they used to be poor and now they're rich, you might think, well, that's cool, but it's not really good news for you. Like, it's good news for them. But if it doesn't impact your life, it's not good news for you. So a gospel is a message, an announcement of good news that is supposed to give you relief or rest or joy in some way. Now, there's a couple types. It's a type of good news to say, here's a future hope. If I were to tell you, life's going to be miserable for the next 30 years, but at the end of that, it's going to be the best you could have imagined. Well, you say, that's good news, but it's not the kind of news I really want to hear. I'd prefer some better news. If I were to tell you, the good news is that the wrongs you have done aren't held against you. But now you've got to live really good now and make sure you don't have any other problems. If you're accused of a crime and you go in and the judge says, we're going to throw this out as your first offense, you don't need to pay this ticket, etc., you say, great, thank you, that is good news. But then he looks at you and says, don't do it again. Because otherwise you'll face the penalty. Right? It's good news. But I'd argue it's not the best good news. I think the best good news that we could have is the kind that gives rest to our soul, both in the past and the present and the future. That's what the best good news would be. So if a gospel is an announcement of good news, here's how you can get rest in your soul. Then we need to look at what is actually being taught. He's clearly angry about what they're teaching. So let's call these people, for the moment, I'm going to call them the agitators, because literally the word here that says they are troubling you in verse 7, that's the root we get. Something is agitated, it's shaken. So what are these false teachers, these agitators coming in and teaching? Well, we can look as we go throughout the book, we'll see some more things. But some of what we see is they're teaching them to follow the Mosaic law, the law given to Moses. Specifically, it included circumcision as part of connecting to God's promises through Abraham. But also, later he speaks to the Galatians, Paul says, you're observing days and months and seasons. He's like, you're observing these ritual calendar events as if that's what gives you favor with God. You've turned from thinking I received this purely through grace, and you're thinking now this obedience, this performance of the right rituals is what gives me favor or fuller blessing from God. So the Galatians are faced with a confusing dilemma. I want you to put yourself in their shoes. First off, this is a fairly early book. That means you had the Old Testament. And maybe you had a copy or two of one of the Gospels, or maybe you've heard one of them and read one, or most likely in the early church, you probably can't read, so somebody read to you. So you have really limited amount of information, and most of what you have is the Old Testament. And then Paul has come and he's taught you grace, he's taught you the gospel, and you say, this is wonderful, I want the gospel, praise God for that. Now, Paul's gone on, Paul's co-laborers have gone on, and here comes, in our modern world, we'll say, here comes some guys who just look slick. They've got their suits on. They look polished and put together. They say, oh, by the way, we're from Jerusalem. They probably didn't speak with a southern accent, but we'll go with it. We're from Jerusalem. James, Peter, yeah, we know them. Peter's our friend. You can't jump online and double check this. Right? You can't go, oh, I've got Peter on speed dial. Let me call and see what's going on in Jerusalem. You don't have any way to do that. All you know is Paul taught me this great message, and he told me that we need to grow in maturity and learn more about how to live with God. Okay, great. Here comes some people who say they know James and Peter, and they're telling us, here's what you need to do. Yes, Paul gave you the gospel. But they want to either change it or add to it, which also changes it, by coming and saying you need to live, perform in a certain way in order to have like the next level of Christianity. The gospel's great, fine, but there's something better, deeper. That's what these teachers are doing. They're shaking the Galatians by saying, here's a way you can enter a second tier of Christian experience. They're telling them, in order to really have God's power and favor and blessing in your life, the gospel isn't enough. Remember we said grace is unmerited favor? Not just unmerited forgiveness and not just unmerited tolerance, but grace through Jesus is God shows undeserved favor to you. So these teachers come and they say, yeah, that's how it starts. But if you want to stay in God's favor, or be in God's favor so much more full and a deeper way, here's what you have to do. This happens all the time. People add to the gospel all the time. And it's appealing to us because we all want to be deeper with God, right? We all say, yeah, I want to go deeper. But the pathway to being deeper with God is not to put aside the gospel. It's not to go deeper somewhere else because the gospel's not sufficient. It's to go deeper into the gospel and its implications for your lives. We never graduate from God's grace. Those of you who have walked with God for a long time, you know this. You don't graduate from God's grace. You go deeper in your understanding of His grace. You don't go from, well, I was saved by unmerited favor, but now I earn this. That's not Christian maturity. That's not deeper. Some of the people in this room can tell you, I know so much more now how I don't deserve God's favor than I did when I started. And yet I love God's favor so much more than I did when I started. They didn't start at the gospel, go somewhere else. They went deeper in the gospel. But these agitators, these troublers, they're coming to Galatians who don't have the New Testament. They can't jump on a phone call with Peter or Paul and check. And they've started to wonder. The way he talks about the gospel here is instructive because he says in verse 6, you are turning to a different gospel. Now, the word there for different is that there's another gospel of a different kind. He's not really saying, here's gospel A, here's gospel B, they're the same. He's saying, the true gospel's here. You're turning to another announcement that says you can have rest or relief, another thing that claims to be good news. And he emphasizes, he says, it's not really another one, verse 7. Not that there is another one. The word for another there is another of the same kind. So he starts with this. He says, you're turning to a different gospel, another of a different kind. Then he emphasizes, not that there's another of the same kind. There's a million ideas out there where people will say, here's how you find rest for your soul. They're all over the place. What Paul's doing here is saying the gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ is not like those. It's a separate category. But the Galatians are tempted to turn to something else. It's claimed as a gospel. Here's good news. That's what these teachers are doing. They're saying, we've got good news for you. But actually, it's undermining grace. We see this later in chapter 2. In his correction, and we'll get to this in a few weeks, Paul says, I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. He says, look, what they're teaching you would nullify, would make the grace of God unimportant. They're undermining God's grace. Later in chapter 5, he says, if you want to keep the law, you're severed from Christ. He says you can't have both, which makes sense, right? You can't have the joy of purely undeserved favor while also saying, I have to do this to deserve favor. They can't fit together. That's precisely what the false teachers are trying to do. I want to tell you, Paul is pointing out if any gospel Any good news. Here's how you can live your life and find rest and relief in the past, in the present, in the future. If any gospel that you hear removes the unmerited favor of God, the grace of God, as the basis and the means of your approval, it's not the same kind of gospel as the grace of Christ. Paul drives this, again, in the strongest language he can. When he says in verse 7, some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Literally, want to reverse the gospel of Christ. In our modern pluralistic world, we're so wired to think, here's a good suggestion, but if I go online, I can find all kinds of good suggestions, so maybe there'll be something good here, and something good here, and something good here to add. Paul's saying you can't do that with the gospel. Because when you add something to the gospel of Jesus, you don't have the gospel of Jesus anymore. So anything that replaces the gospel so changes God's message that it's not good news anymore. But not just replaces, let's go a step further. In verse 8, he says, if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you. Literally, the construction here in Greek is a gospel set alongside. It's contrary, not in the sense that they're saying absolute opposite things, but he's drawing your attention to something that says, if the good news is I can be approved by God's favor alone, if you set anything else alongside that, you no longer have the good news. Think about it this way. Think about human relationships. If you say, husbands, don't try this, but husbands, if you said to your wives, I love you no matter what happens, unconditionally, all the time, you can say that, that's fine. Don't say the next part. And I'll love you as long as you have dinner ready at this time every day. The first statement doesn't mean anything anymore, does it? See, you can't put unmerited, unconditional grace alongside performance to earn favor. They do not work together. Whatever you put there, it could be dinner, it could be a clean house, it could be working your job well, it could be parenting, it could be trips to school. It doesn't matter. Whatever you put alongside undeserved grace and unconditional love makes it no longer undeserved grace or unconditional love. When he says the gospel contrary, he's saying not only the obvious things where somebody comes along and says, no, it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have to do good works, and if your good outweighs your bad, then therefore you can be right with God. That's obviously against the gospel of Jesus Christ. But he's also saying when someone comes alongside and says, yes, the gospel of Jesus Christ, but if you want to really enjoy the deeper favor of God that you don't quite have yet, then the gospel of Jesus plus this. That's the strongest language Paul gives. Paul says, look, if you claim to endorse the gospel, but put something else alongside it, that's when he says, let them be accursed. Because it changes what the gospel actually is. For years, the primary treatment for malaria was quinine. And it worked sometimes, fairly often. But sometimes it didn't work completely. So doctors would also prescribe, this sounds like a terrible idea, but they would prescribe arsenic compounds, which also, when used correctly, medically, did some good. But when they would treat malaria with quinine and arsenic compounds, both of those attack your neurological system. I don't know how all that works. Somebody else can give you the scientific pathway. But people would die. From a good cure, and actually a pretty good cure over here for some things, used together. Paul knew that in adding anything alongside the gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ, the false teachers were adding arsenic to the cure of the gospel. He knew it was fatal. That's why he's so strong and says, I'm astonished. Don't desert. Let those be accursed who are doing this, because he knew it would not give them rest for their souls. It was no longer good news. So this morning, we all feel at times unrest. We all feel the weight. We feel guilt. We feel shame in different ways. We need a gospel, a good news that says, here's how I deal with that. Where are we tempted to look? What cures do we look towards? And as we go through the book of Galatians, we'll see the specific false teachings that these teachers are teaching, and we'll see how Paul directly addresses it. But this morning, what I want to do is just go through some potential false cures. Ask yourself, do I look to these things to give me relief or rest in my soul? We might have the approval gospel. I think if people approve of me, then my soul can rest. Might be something like this. Ray Ortlund, in his commentary on Proverbs, described modern humanity this way. Here's our man-made religion. Our God is human approval. Our heaven is the spotlight. Our hell is bad reviews. And our ritual of worship is keeping up appearances. That's one gospel. It's one good news. Here's how you can have rest. Be good enough that the people around you approve of you. We can try that. We might think, I'm smarter than that. I don't care what other people think about me. Because it might be my own approval that I'm actually living for. When we think we're succeeding, I think people do approve of me. We can be so afraid that I'll slip up. See, if all your energy, if your soul is okay because you keep up appearances, you have to be terrified that you might not keep up appearances. Have you ever been worried that people might find you out? They might decide you're just an imposter. What are we looking to for rest in our souls? When we think we're succeeding, we're afraid we'll slip up. When we think we've failed, we have to hide it. Because the good news for our soul, when we look to approval, the good news is not one of grace and forgiveness. It's one of performance and measuring up. The gospel of approval asks more than you can give, and it crushes you when you fail. That doesn't sound like good news, so let's try a different one. Maybe we have the prosperity gospel. And we think, if I measure up, if I live a good enough life, then I'll get stuff, and if I have the right stuff, then my soul can rest. Now, we define being good enough or measuring up in 1,000 different ways. We say, well, if I give enough to people, if I attend church, if I'm basically kind to people, if I avoid major sins, like we can define it all kinds of different ways. But the essence of the good news is, if I live the right way, then I'll have the right stuff, then I'll have rest in my soul. Or I have rest in my soul because I'm in control. The way I live determines my experience. But this gospel suffers the same problems as approval. How much is enough for my soul to rest? When do I say, I've done enough good things, so now I get the good stuff and I just relax? Well, when do I ever get to that point? I don't. What happens if I fail? Say, the prosperity gospel sounds good until you're coming back after you've messed up a lot and say, uh-oh, that's not a good sign for the rest of my life. That's not good news. And then our experiences raise questions too, because you look around and see people who lived good lives. seemingly, but they suffer. And you see people who lived awful lives, and they seem to prosper. So we say, maybe it's not about the stuff I possess. Maybe it's not about controlling that. We'll call it the pleasure gospel. When I need rest for my soul, I'll just go to the right places and I'll just be a consumer and enjoy what I can find. In this case, our God is really ourselves. Our heaven is pleasure. Our hell is suffering. And our ritual of worship could look like all kinds of things. Maybe it's drugs and excessive alcohol. Maybe it's pornography or mindless sinful entertainment. Maybe it's food or laziness. Whatever gives us pleasure. This is one good news, claims to be. Here's all you have to do. Enjoy whatever you enjoy, and that'll give your soul rest. But we know better, don't we? Say, when is it ever enough? You eat the best steak you've ever had, and the pleasure is just unimaginably good, and guess what? Tomorrow you're hungry. It's always true. Enjoyment of God's good gifts is wonderful, but it will not give us rest in our souls, and if we look to it as if it will, it's just a counterfeit cure that's deadly. If we take the gospel and put alongside it pleasure or approval or prosperity, we find the gospel is no longer really good news because we polluted it. Well, then we say, what about the productivity gospel? You guys can imagine what that might sound like. If I can accomplish enough things, then my soul will have rest. If I can get the to-do list whittled down enough, then I'll rest. Or a variant of this, if I get the career I want and find fulfillment in that, then my soul can find rest. In this case, our God is efficiency. Our heaven is a finished project. Our hell is being overwhelmed. And our ritual of worship is just accomplishing the next task. Many of those things can be good. Approval can be wonderful. Pleasure is one of God's gifts. Prosperity is one of God's gifts. Productivity is a good thing from God. But if that's what is going to make your soul be okay, that's going to give you rest, it gives you refuge and relief from the difficulties and challenges, it will never do it. It doesn't work because, again, it's never enough. Have you noticed your to-do list always repopulates? It always does. It's never enough. And what about the days when you say, I just messed it all up? All I did was add things. I didn't accomplish anything. It's never enough, and there's no forgiveness when you fail. So then we say it's not about the amount of things. It's if I can just accomplish the things that I do well enough. Right? It's not going to be the productivity gospel. It's like the excellence gospel. I'm only going to do one thing, but it's going to be great. My soul will rest in that. No, it won't. So we swing the pendulum again. We say, okay, I know productivity can't help me. If I accomplish it really well, that doesn't give me rest in my soul. So I'm going to learn from others' mistakes. I'm going to work on my work-life balance. We have this kind of self-care gospel that says, I'll just take enough things off my to-do list. If I can just retire early, not have to accomplish anything, then my soul will find rest. But like all of these gospels, it might work for a time, but eventually you find it's never enough for your soul to be satisfied and for your soul to rest, and there's no forgiveness when you fail. Humans are magnificently and sometimes sinfully creative. We can come up with all kinds of things to put alongside the gospel of the grace of Jesus. We might put sincerity there. Call it the sincerity gospel. I know I don't measure up in everything. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm sincere, so my soul's going to be okay. I'm glad you're sincere. I don't want you to be hypocritical or lying. But that's not what's going to give you rest in your soul. It's just an attempt to control my unrest by performing the right way. I can't measure up, so I'll lower the bar as far as I have to so that it works. Maybe we put alongside the gospel of the grace of Jesus, we put alongside different versions of tradition. That's where I'm going to take refuge. Maybe it's simple nostalgia. Want to live in the good old ways. There's a country song that said, I miss Mayberry where everything was black and white. Yeah. Why does that appeal to us? Part of it appeals to us because we say, my soul is okay if things are familiar enough. It feels in control. My rest in my soul. Maybe it's cultural tradition. Maybe it's personal tradition. This is just the way my family did it. Maybe it's religious tradition. We always sing these songs, not other ones. We look to, this is the teaching I've heard, and I can't examine that and see if it's right or wrong. We look back and say, my soul may not really be at rest, but the way we've always done it is good enough to be close to rest. Again, these things cannot be said alongside the gospel. I don't think you can hear I don't think you can hear Paul's words and over-exaggerate the importance of what he's saying. He's saying in the biggest terms he can, the gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ is what gives rest for your soul. And if you put anything alongside it, the gospel plus this, it's no longer the gospel and it will not give you rest in your soul. False gospels only have power because they tap into some truth and pervert it. Some of the things I just listed are very good gifts from our Father. I am glad we have 2,000 years of believers who have tried to follow him. I'm glad we have multiple generations in this room. There are good traditions. I am glad that we can look back and say, God has given me good things to enjoy. God has given me approval with him and with his people. I am glad for these things. There are great, wonderful things, but every one of them has the same kinds of problems. They cannot give rest for our souls. And if we try to say the gospel plus this, we'll just find that it's like adding arsenic compounds to quinine. It doesn't heal our souls. We find ourselves in bondage. And I think if we were only faced with one false gospel, we'd see through it pretty quickly. We know if you take an empty glass and try to drink from it, it won't satisfy your thirst. And if I were to tell you the rest for your soul comes through having enough money, you'd say, nah, I know better. If I picked any one of those and said, this is what will make your soul have relief and rest that you can just count on for all of your life, you'd say, no, it doesn't work like that. But I'm afraid sometimes we think the empty glass won't satisfy my thirst, but maybe if I sip out of 40 different empty glasses, I'll be satisfied. So what we do, we feel the unrest in our souls. We feel, I don't measure up. We feel, I don't even approve of myself. So we try to work a little harder. When that doesn't work, we try to work a little more. When that doesn't work, we chase a little pleasure. When that doesn't work, we do some good works. When that doesn't work, we try to find something that just feels good to numb us. We chase all of these different things in little tastes. And what starts out trying to work hard and do good works may end in bitterness, vengeful thoughts, addiction, because we're trying to find something to give our souls peace. And none of them work. That's because we've turned from the God of grace. Remember, he doesn't say merely you've deserted the gospel. He says you are quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ. These are teachers from Jerusalem. They're Jews who are troubling them. They're the religious people. They're the God-fearing people. That's what they claim. They come along saying, yeah, good, glad you have what you have, but I want to help you go deeper and understand how your performance really earns you favor with God. It's the religious-looking people who are troubling them. The church's greatest enemies are never its persecutors. They're people who pervert and twist the true gospel. If you don't believe that, go look at what's happened in the Chinese church as persecution comes, or around the world throughout history. External persecution is terrible, but it doesn't eat at the church the way perversion of the gospel does. You can't add anything to the gospel of Jesus Christ as a way of earning favor with God. You can't add church attendance. You can't add fasting. You can't add prayer. Say, whoa, prayer's a good thing, right? Yes, of course. But if you pray because you think that is going to earn you favor with God, you are missing the joy and the comfort of the gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ. If you think church attendance makes God say, you know, I actually do like that person, you're deserting the grace of God through Jesus. God can and does use things like prayer, but prayer is not a gatekeeper for his favor. God shows unmerited favor. Every good news that we've talked about, every false gospel you can find other than the grace of Christ, it only brings a curse. They're thieves. They steal rest from your soul. They don't give it. But in our experience, we know reality relentlessly crushes false gospels. Whatever you say, I'll find rest in this. If it's not Jesus, just give it time. You'll see it won't work. That's because every one of them has the same two problems. They're never enough, and there's no forgiveness when you fail. They cannot be good news. So like Paul says, a little different context, in Romans 7, he says, oh, wretched man that I am. Do you feel that? You say, I do rush to this false gospel and this one and this one and this one, and they never seem to work. It's awful. Who will deliver me from this body of death? And Paul in Romans has given that answer. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ. He's also already given that answer in Galatians. Grace to you and peace from God our Father. The false gospels are never enough. We already talked about it this morning. Jesus said, it is finished. It's enough. When you say, I don't measure up and my soul feels that, but Jesus said he did measure up. And it is finished. It is enough. Enough for what? Enough for God to be satisfied. If he's satisfied, I think we're okay. Enough to absorb all of God's wrath on our sins so that he is not tolerating us, he's completely for us. Enough for us to be approved or to be justified. False gospels are never enough, and there's no forgiveness when you fail. The true gospel of Jesus Christ, Jesus said, is enough, and what happens when we fail? We confess and we find an advocate with God, Jesus, before his throne. We have a God who announces himself in Exodus. He's a God who's merciful and gracious, who keeps steadfast love. We have a God who died for us while we were sinners. So our future sin can't turn him against us because he knew about all of that. And we were sinners when he died for us. Unlike every false gospel, the gospel of God's grace, his unmerited favor towards everyone who trusts in him, does not leave you straining for a little bit more and wallowing in guilt. The gospel of God's grace says it is enough and our Savior's forgiveness is sufficient. So grace to you and peace and rest. The real gospel gives you rest in your souls. Romans 5 says, therefore, having been justified by faith, by our reliance on him, we have peace with God. Peace that is enough to give you rest in your soul. And as he said, we overflow in worship. To whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. So I want to ask you, what gospel are you functionally believing? How many of those false gospels or hundreds others we could chase do you find your soul swinging towards? If I could just have this, then my soul could rest. They might look religious. They might look like good works. They might look like ugly sins you'd rather stay hidden and no one knew about. But the invitation is, there's only one real gospel, real good news. Come to the Savior who is enough and who forgives you when you fall. I want to invite you just to take a minute. Wherever God's Spirit has brought conviction to you, wherever you recognize struggles in your heart, would you run to Jesus? Trust in God's unmerited favor for you. I'll ask the music team to come back up, and then we'll sing together and rejoice in the goodness of Jesus.